Just joking. We're glad that you're here. I was kidding, yeah. I just saw a lot of empty seats earlier this morning. But anyway, we are glad that you're here. When you came in this morning, you should have got a program. Members, you know what to do with the little envelope in there. Everybody else, we'd love for you to tear off this sheet on the side and fill it out. It's called a connection card. It's how we keep track of the fact that you're here. If you have a prayer request, there's a place on the back to write that down. The basket's going to be coming around in just a minute. So go ahead and get that ready. About 7 weeks ago now, we did a series for a couple of weeks called Forward. And this past week, I believe there were 34 streams that had got moved from the full bucket to the empty bucket. And you can see that we're making progress. Here's last week. There we go. There's last week. So we are moving our way around forward. It's not about completing the picture. It's about earning the right to be heard so that one day we can tell the people of Jackson that Jesus is for them and we are for them. And so is Highland Park. Probably many of you at one point or another in your life, you haven't been very happy. And so you went out and you tried to find something to do to make yourselves happy. Guys, maybe like me, when you're unhappy, you go to the gym. Right? Some of y'all are like, man, he stays happy all the time. Well, or maybe you go out to the woods and go hunt. Y'all didn't get that? I'm fat. Never mind. All right, that's okay. That's okay. Maybe when you're unhappy, you go out and you go hunting, sit in the woods by yourself. Okay? Ladies, maybe you go to the store, you go shopping, you buy some new shoes. She said sold. But when you get back home, a day or two later, you realize that you're still unhappy. That maybe what you chose to do to produce happiness gave you some momentary pleasure or a temporary distraction, but it did not change your state of unhappiness. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I hate that so many people are not here today because I think this is going to hit home with a lot of us. Ushers, if you'll come forward with the baskets, I'm going to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll pass the baskets, and Johnny and the band will take back over. God, thank you so much for the opportunity that we've had these past few weeks to be in this series called What Makes You Happy, and just to see what it is that you are trying to communicate with us about being truly happy. And Lord, as we talk today about these distractions that we tend to enter ourselves into to bring about a sense of happiness, Lord, I pray that your Holy Spirit would work on the inside of each one of us and reveal to us what those areas are in our lives that we have been trying to distract ourselves with that maybe have gone too far. Lord, we pray that everything that is given this morning and everything that is said this morning would bring glory and honor to your name and your kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray.
struggles or the circumstances that they may be tough, but to trust that you have overcome the world. Lord, we believe in you this morning. We're listening for your word. In Jesus' name.
All right. Good morning again. I'm glad to see a couple more seats have filled up since welcome time. I believe that the message that we are sharing today, when we get started, some of you are going to be thinking of other people. And you're going to be thinking of other people in your lives that need to hear this today. Just trust me on that. So if you've got your phones, get out Facebook real quick while I'm getting this introduction started and share today's message. If you don't believe, wait till we're done and then you'll share it. It doesn't matter to me. But I just believe that's the case. But I think also that some of us are going to realize that today's message is for us as well. Something that is hard for me to watch and consequently has led me to some of the choices that I have made in my life. It's why I teach daily at a Christian school. It's why I'm here doing youth ministry, and it's even partly why I'm up here this morning communicating with you, is watching people make choices and make mistakes that undermine their happiness and steal their peace. And as a youth minister and as a teacher, I see it a lot, and it almost never helps to jump in and interject. As a parent, I see it, and sometimes I have to sit back and just watch it because my kids don't want to learn from my mistakes and listening to me. They want to figure it out on their own. And oftentimes, when you've seen it enough, it becomes like a wreck that you're in. You know how it slows down and you know it's coming? You know it's going to happen, but things just slow down. You see a young lady that chooses to date a young man who isn't emotionally ready to be with a cactus. And you know that a wreck is coming, but she doesn't listen because he's cute and his hair is nice and, you know, whatever. He's got abs, I don't know. Or you see a young couple who's raising a child and they're doing stuff that you already made those mistakes. And you really want to say something. Because you know what's coming 2 years and 3 years and 5 years down the road, but you don't know if you should say something or not. And the truth of the matter is there are enough unavoidable pains in our lives that we don't need to add to them by self-inflicting more pain with poor choices. In fact, one of the promises that Jesus made to us is that in this world we will have trouble. Now, nobody embroiders that and hangs it above their kitchen sink, right? That's not one of the promises that we cling to. But it is true nonetheless. With all the unavoidable troubles in this world, why do we sow things that are ultimately going to undermine our peace and steal our happiness? And I think that one of the major issues that leads to these choices that we make is the confusion around the relationship between these two words, pleasure and happiness. And these are the two words today that we are going to focus on. Specifically, we are going to focus on the relationship that exists between these two words. And we're going to jump in today looking at some of the words of Jesus. And Jesus, in my opinion, and I don't know how it couldn't be true, but it's just my opinion, had to be the greatest communicator that ever lived. I mean, he was God in flesh, right? And so he's talking to the crowd one day, and he realizes that he has this spiritual thing that he wants them to understand, and he knows that this is going to be tough. And so he takes it to the bottom level, and he puts it in a vernacular that they are very familiar with. Something that he just knows that they are going to be able to grasp and hold on to. Because it is so ingrained in their lives and in part of their culture. The problem It's not so much for us. But let's begin to look at the scripture today. We are going to start with John 10:10. And this is a very familiar verse, I know. It says, the thief. The word thief there in the Greek is the word klepto, which is where we get our word, anybody know? Kleptomaniac. Very good. A kleptomaniac is someone who steals and then steals again and they can't seem to control it. They just steal, right? Okay. So the thief, the one who steals and steals and steals again, comes only to steal and kill and to destroy. And in the context of this passage, in the context of John chapter 10, this thief, this kleptomaniac, is anyone who would come into your life and steal from your future. It's anyone that would come into your life and kill a relationship. It's anyone that would come into your life and try to destroy it. Anyone can be a thief in your life. But this is one of those hard things to hear. Do you know, and I'm especially talking to adults here, probably anyone over the age of 16, okay? Do you know what person it is in your life that has the most or the greatest potential to steal from your future, to kill a relationship, or to destroy your life? Who is that? The answer is the same for all of us. It is the central picture, or the central person in a picture or in a selfie. It's the person that we look at in the mirror every morning. Potentially, you are the biggest thief in your life. Potentially, you are the kleptomaniac who is stealing and killing and destroying from yourself. And perhaps you have heard it said this way, I am my own worst enemy, right? And that's true, and it's no fun to hear, but you and I are our own worst enemies. You have done more to steal from your future, to ruin relationships, and to destroy your own happiness than anyone around you ever could. You know how I know that? I know that because you bought it. I know that because you leased it. I know that because you ate it. I know that because you drank it. I know that because you smoked it. I know that because you dated it. And I know that because some of you married it. Right? You are the person who is in the greatest potential to be the kleptomaniac in your life. You did those things. You did them to yourself. You are the common denominator for every single event of your life. You are your own worst enemy. You are the thief that looks in the mirror every morning. And Jesus says that the one who steals from your future, the one who kills your relationships, the one who destroys your happiness is most often you. But thankfully, Jesus doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop on that downer, because right now you feel about as good about yourself as I probably do about myself. He adds to it this very cool statement. Let's go back to the verse. It says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and to destroy. But I, talking about Jesus, Jesus is saying this, I have come that they, who's the they? Well, originally it was the people listening, but it's us, right? I have come that the people sitting in the chairs and on the stage at Highland Park Church may have life. And then it's kind of like the crowd doesn't quite get it or doesn't realize how significant it is that Jesus came, that they would have life. And so he adds this to it. He says, and have it to the full. Now the problem with that word full there is that it really doesn't begin to fully explain what Jesus meant with the Greek word that he used. And some of you, like me, you grew up, at least for a few years, on the King James, and you might remember the word that it used in the King James instead of full. Does anybody remember? Abundantly, right? And that is a much better word. I don't know why the NIV got rid of that word. I'm not sure. But that's a much better word for us to understand the type of life that Jesus came to give you and I. It is the idea of having an extraordinary life. The kind of life that when people meet you, they're like, wow. It isn't that you don't have your share of problems, because we've all been promised we are going to have troubles. But it's this thing that somehow is on the inside of you that comes through in all the circumstances and in all the troubles of your life that makes people notice that you are different. He says, I have come that you might have an abundant life. And then he makes this statement about himself, because he wants them to understand that his coming did not give them the abundant life. It's something else that gives them this abundant life. So he goes on and he says, I'm the good shepherd. And the crowds are like, okay, now Jesus, we get it. We understand shepherds. We know what it looks like when we see a good shepherd. So in their mind, they're like, okay, Jesus, just how good a shepherd are you? And he goes on to say this, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Wow. They get this. You and I don't quite get it, but they get it because they know what a shepherd had to do. And they know that at night when the sheep are all asleep, and the only way for the enemy to get in at the sheep was for the shepherd to lay down in front of the gate and separate the dumb sheep from the ferocious world, was for the shepherd to lay down in front of the gate, to put himself in the place of the sheep if the enemy were to come. And they get it. And they understand. And no matter where you read in the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, you need to understand that every word of the Bible is in the context that God loves this world, that he loves you, and that he loves me so much that he sent his son Jesus into the world to lay down his life for us, to die for us, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Let me explain something to you. It's on the screen. If someone is willing to lay down their life for you, then they are for you. If someone is willing to give up their life for you, then they are truly for you. And this stands in sharp contrast to verse 10, to the kleptomaniac who comes to kill and steal and to destroy. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. How good? Well, the thief steals. I came to give. The thief destroys. I came to build. The thief kills, and I came to protect. Oh, they thought. That's how good of a shepherd you are. You and I, we have to make a decision in this life. Are we going to follow the thief? Even if the thief is the person that we see in the mirror every morning, are we going to follow the thief, or are we going to follow the good shepherd, Jesus, who is for you? The good shepherd who is for me. The good shepherd who laid down his life for us. Now that's the awesome part of this word picture. If you're a Christian, you should have goosebumps, or the hairs on the back of your head should be standing up, because you ought to be thinking about just how good a shepherd you have, because you know that he died for you and he gave his life up for you, and that ought to be awesome. But for those of you who aren't Christians, and for the rest of us, the word picture kind of takes a turn for the nurse. Or the worse. Never mind. Anyway, that was just for Tanner. But anyway, so here's the problem with this word picture. Here's where it takes a turn for the worse, because Jesus, even though he is comparing himself to the good shepherd, he is comparing you and I to the sheep. And as I've already let the cat out of the bag a few minutes ago, sheep, to kindly put it, aren't very smart. In fact, some people would say they're worse than dumb, they're just downright stupid. And this might be offensive to some of you. Some of you are like, well, I made a 30 on my ACT, or I was the valedictorian in my high school, or you don't know what I've done with my life. Well, here's how I know that you're a sheep. Because you bought it, you leased it, you ate it, you drank it, you smoked it, you dated with it, you may have slept with it, and you might have married it. You have made some bad decisions. Thank you. All right. You have made some bad decisions, and it has stolen your peace, and it has killed your happiness. And Jesus looks at you and me, and he says, sheep, I love you. Sheep, I am the good shepherd who loved you enough to lay down his life for you. Follow me. Follow me. I'm crackling up here. Is it crackling out there? Okay. You can turn the monitors off if you know how to do that. I don't know if it's possible. But they're crackling. Sorry about that. You and I may be our own worst enemy. And I would imagine that there have been times, especially mature, older adults, older, not really mature, because I'm pointing myself, but you older adults like me, I would imagine that all of you can look back on your life and see a time that you were the thief, that you were the one who did everything necessary to steal, to kill, and destroy from yourself. But you are not your only enemy. In week 1, I introduced another thief. And that thief is this word, sin. And we kind of define sin, and I even said you can make up your own definition for sin. If you don't buy into mine, that doesn't matter. We all get the idea that sin is doing something that ain't right, that somebody views ain't right, right? So we're all kind of on the same page with that. But the authors of the New Testament, when it comes to this concept of sin, they sort of give sin a personality of its own. And they kind of give it a life of its own. So that sin can also be a thief in your life. And we know this because sin separates, right? Sin separates you from God. We talked about that, right? Sin gets in the way between you and your relationship to God, and thankfully he sent his son Jesus to mend that relationship. But sin separates. Not only does sin separate you from God, but sin separates you from other people. Everybody in here who has a broken relationship, when you think about that relationship, you believe that somebody sinned. Whether it was the other person or yourself or both, sin separates. Sin can also separate you from yourself. And some of you may have heard somebody say this. I hope that you haven't said this, but I couldn't live with myself if I blank. I couldn't live with myself if I did whatever. Think about that for a minute. Some of you have heard somebody say that. Why? Because there is some sin that in that person's mind, if they did, they would want to separate from themselves. Sin can separate us from ourselves because it gives us this internal struggle. Sin is not your friend. And to use Jesus' term, sin comes only to steal and kill and to destroy. Sin is a trap. And it ensnares us. It baits us in. It looks so good. And then all of a sudden there's something clamped down on us that brings us pain. And it's so much pain we're not even wise enough to reach down and pull it open. Because sin is a trap. And many of us, we've figured that out. We've seen other people that have struggled with it. But even though we figured that out, we still sometimes fall into it. But why do we fall into it? And I'm going to come back to our original word picture. Because it is this confusion between the relationship of pleasure and happiness that keeps allowing us to become the thief. It is this confusion between the relationship between pleasure and happiness that keeps causing us to fall into the trap of sin in our lives. I should have started with less excitement in my voice. At the center of most temptation is this confusion between pleasure and happiness. And I'm about to rock some of your worlds, and some of you whose children are in here, you may, wish you had covered their ears, but this is true. God created you and me with the capacity to experience both. He created you and me with the capacity to experience both pleasure and happiness. And I know this is going to be shocking, but God created sexual pleasure. Somewhere toward the end of creation, I don't know exactly where, He said, wow, I had this great idea. And the angels are like, what, God? And He's like, you couldn't understand, right? And He created sexual pleasure. Some of you aren't going to like this. But Jesus, the first miracle recorded that He ever did was creating wine. And I got to be honest with you, I don't really like that. Because I don't drink at all, ever, any period. None. But the first miracle Jesus ever chose to do, you got to think that the disciples were sitting around the wedding feast table saying, Jesus, are you sure this is going to be the one? Don't you think they wanted him to heal somebody or, redo the Red Sea or something like that? But He didn't. He created wine at a party. And I don't understand that. But Jesus did that. And not only that, all the disciples wore shoes, ladies. But anyway, God created you and I with the capacity to have both pleasure and happiness in our lives. God is pro-pleasure and God is pro-happiness. The problem is not either or. You remember that discussion that we had about the dichotomy between holiness and happiness when we were kids growing up in church? When I was growing up in church, I had this picture in my mind that God didn't really care if I was happy. He just wanted me to be holy. But that's not true. God does want me to be holy, but He also wants me to be happy. Because it's not about either or. And it's not about either or when it comes to pleasure or happiness. The question is a matter of priority. The question is a matter of priority. Because see, here's the thing. One of those things will lead to the other. But the other one of those things, when put out of order, will always undermine the other. Happiness has to come before pleasure. We have to choose happiness before we choose pleasure. We have to prioritize happiness over pleasure, because if we don't, if we put pleasure in front of happiness, eventually we will reap neither. Eventually we will reap neither. If you choose happiness, if you choose what God says, what Jesus says about being happy, one day you will be enjoying pleasure that you never knew you could enjoy. But if you choose pleasure before God's way of happiness, one day the pleasure that you thought you were enjoying will lose pleasure completely, and you will become a prisoner to it. If you put pleasure first, one day you will find yourself in shackles to what you originally thought was pleasure to you. What begins as a pastime, what begins as a distraction when you're unhappy, becomes a pathway, and it leads to a prison. And those distractions, those choices don't have to be big sins. They don't have to be illegal. They don't have to be necessarily immoral. But in your life and in my life, when we put any pleasure over the principle of happiness, all the pleasure will lose its pleasure. 30 years after Jesus was talking to those people, in John 10, Paul comes along. And Paul is a Jew by birth who was raised in a Gentile society. He was a Roman citizen. And so when he comes along, Jesus pulls him out of a life of literally attacking Christianity, and he saves him, right? And he uses his understanding of our Gentile mindset to translate his teachings in the Gospels to the Gentile community. And in another passage that we're going to look at, in Romans 6:16, it starts out and it says, "Don't you know?" Now, Paul is kind of a debater kind of guy. And a little like me, he's kind of a smart aleck. And so when he says, "Don't you know?" the answer is, no, you don't. You don't get it yet. That's why I'm starting with "don't you know," because at the end of this, you're going to feel dumb. He goes on to say, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey?" And for you and I who don't live in that culture, this is way over our heads or under our feet or something. I don't know where it is, but we don't quite get it. So what he's saying is when you offer yourself, when you say yes to something, when you allow something to come into your life over and over and over again, you no longer have control. You have become a slave. And you are opening the door of your life every time it's called, because it has become your master, whatever it is. He goes on to say this, that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey. Whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death. You see, all sin leads to death. All sin kills. It kills relationships. We've all witnessed that. It kills marriages. We've all seen it. Even if it wasn't in our own life, we've seen it in someone else's. It ruins jobs. We've seen that, right? It's in the papers all the time, where sin gets into somebody's life and all of a sudden this guy who had a great living and a great family has neither one. Because sin brings death. Sin kills. But then Paul says this, or there is an alternative. Or whether it is to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience. Now, I always say when I'm talking about obedience that that's the four-letter word that no young person likes, right? But I'm pretty convinced that none of us like that four-letter word, obey. Because when we are obeying, we are not in charge, and we don't like that, right? We like to be in charge. He says, but you are going to be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you have a choice to be a slave to obedience, which leads to righteousness. Now that righteousness is a big word that means this. It means if you obey God, you will stand in a right relationship with God. It brings righteousness. You have a choice. You can choose to bring death into your life, or you can choose to bring a right standing with God into your life. It is your choice. Did no one tell you, when you offer yourself to pleasure, you become pleasure's slaves? When you give in to pleasure, you become the slave to pleasure. It no longer is a pleasure for you anymore. The pleasure is gone because you are in shackles. But when you offer yourself to obedience, when you offer yourself to obedience to God, you have peace with God. When you have peace with God, it paves the way to peace with others, and it equips us to have peace with others. It paves the way to peace with ourselves, and it equips us to make peace with others. But it all begins with the choice of obedience. Too often we want to choose pleasure. Obedience is part of the happy train. Pleasure is part of the death train. Pleasure is part of the kill train. Obedience is part of the happy train. When you opt to follow the Good Shepherd, you are opting for obedience to God, which leads to peace. And peace always brings happiness. If you say yes over and over again to any pleasure, you have become a slave to it, and you have traded off your happiness. You are going to reap unhappiness. Jesus said it this way. Jesus said, sow better, to reap better, to feel better. Sow better, to reap better, to feel better. When we aren't happy and we're tempted to opt for pleasure in order to feel better, we need to instead realize that unhappiness is going to return, and you and I need to sow better than that. Because if we don't, that choice of pleasure is going to lead us into a personal prison. You are undermining your own happiness and becoming a slave to that pleasure. According to Jesus, if we sow better, we will reap better, and we will feel better. But it does not happen immediately. It does not happen overnight. Pleasure is the quick fix. Pleasure is what you get at the quick stop. Pleasure is what you get in that phone call to that girl that you've called so many times, or to that phone call to that guy that you've called over and over again. And we all know where those things lead. But if we sow better, if we follow the principles of happiness by being obedient to God, down the road, we're going to feel better. Down the road, we're going to be reaping happiness. It's not a quick fix. It's a process. It's a journey. It's taking everything that we've been talking about for the past 4 weeks and what we're talking about today, and even where we're going to go next week. And it's saying that those are the choices that I'm going to make. Because I know that when I make those choices, I'm going to have peace with God, peace with myself, peace with others. And any time that I have peace, I am going to reap happiness. That's it. That's the message. We've got a choice to make. Are we going to keep choosing the thief? Even if it's the person we see in the mirror in the morning? Or are we going to choose Jesus, the Good Shepherd? I'm going to ask Johnny to come down and play this morning. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. But definitely something that I haven't done here. I want to ask you a question. Is there a pleasure in your life that is undermining your happiness? Is there a pleasure in your life that is taking away your happiness? That is becoming your prison? And I realize, psychologically speaking, you're like, nope. Because if I admit there is, then I've got to do something. No, you don't. You don't have to do anything. I just want you to honestly ask yourselves, is there a pleasure in your life that is undermining your happiness? Perhaps that pleasure is also beginning to undermine the happiness of someone that you love. Because we've all seen that. We've all seen marriages that have fallen apart because one person or the other had this guilty little pleasure that they thought they had under control. And down the road, they found themselves in a prison to that pleasure. And they also found themselves having destroyed the relationship with the person that they loved. Is there something that you are losing your freedom to say no to? Is there something in your life that started as a distraction that now every time it calls, you feel like you have to open the door and let it in? Is there a pleasure in your life that is beginning to function like a warden for you? I want you to bow your heads for just a minute. I told you I was going to do something that I, as far as I know, have never done here. But I want you to bow your heads, and I want you to think about those questions. Is there a pleasure that is undermining your happiness? Is there a pleasure that is undermining the happiness of someone that you love? Is there a pleasure that is robbing your freedom that you can no longer say no to, and it has become a warden in your life? Are you slowly losing your freedom to say no to it without ever meaning to? You have somehow prioritized this pleasure over godly choices that will lead to happiness. If that's the case, maybe today should be the day that you trade that pleasure for a good shepherd. Maybe today should be the day that you go back to your shepherd and quit wandering in your pleasure that has you locked in. Because it is going to drain your life and ultimately lead to death. And there is a good shepherd waiting there to give you an abundant life that will be like wow to everyone around you when they see the changes taking place in you. Here's the thing that I've never done before. You keep your heads bowed and your eyes closed. If there's somebody in here that would say yes to any one of those questions, I want you to raise your hand today so that I can pray for you. Nobody looking around. If there's some pleasure that is taking your joy, that is stealing your happiness, and that you know is going to lead you into prison, just raise your hand. I see it. You can put it back down. I see it. One more chance. Anybody else? I got it. I want to pray for you. When I get done praying, Wayne's going to come up and he's going to do announcements, and they're going to be humorous as always. But I want you to know that when I get done praying and he gets done making an announcement, this invitation isn't over. If you raised your hand and there's something that you need to talk about, something that you need help to work through so that you can get out of jail from that pleasure, I'm going to be down front. And if you know me, you don't even have to come up here this morning. You shoot me a text and I'll meet you wherever you want to. But I do know this. John said that if we confess our sins to one another, that it changes things. And so, if I'm praying for you this morning, when Wayne gets done making those announcements, if you don't just want my help, but you want the help of your family in Highland Park, or maybe even these strangers in green seats that you don't know, then come on down. I promise nobody's going to gawk at you here because we all got problems. Everybody else is going to get up and head to life group. But if I'm praying for you this morning and you want to talk about it now, you come on down and you just know that the people who see you, they're going to love you enough to pray for you. Let me pray for you right now. God, I couldn't even count the number of hands this morning of people who feel like they're either in bondage or they're heading into bondage and it's hurting the people that they love. God, my prayer this morning is that their raising their hands would be the first step to them beginning to sow obedience that will yield happiness. And God, my prayer for myself is that you would give me and the leadership of our church the wisdom and the strength to walk alongside the people that have the courage to come forward this morning. To help them through the tough spots that are going to come when they stop opening the door. And to love them through the difficult times when they open the door that they never thought they'd open again. Until that one day they would look back and they'd yell freedom. Because the Good Shepherd has come through on the promise of abundant life. Jesus, it is in your powerful, mighty, chain-breaking name that I pray.
announcements this morning. Our library team is looking for some assistance. If you would be interested in volunteering in the library, please stop by and talk to Barney or Sue Cruz or Mona Fanning to get more information. You don't need to have experience, but it would help if you can at least sing the ABC song. The women's Bible study, Seamless,